This is Joel Kotkin.
And this is Marshall Toplansky.
And you're listening to the Feudal Future podcast. Our society is being rapidly reduced to a feudal state, a process now being exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic. Millions of small businesses are near extinction. Millions more are losing their jobs, and many others will be stuck in the status of propertyless serfs. The big winners have been the expert class of the clerisy, and most of all, the tech oligarchs, who benefit as people rely more on algorithms than human relationships.
With this, around the world, the middle class is becoming more squeezed than ever, and it's having profound economic, social, and spiritual implications. Here on the show, we're having conversations with business, government, and citizen leaders like you to get to the core of these issues and explore how we can work together to form a better future than the one we're headed towards. Hello and welcome to another exciting and special episode of the Feudal Future podcast. I'm Marshall Toplansky.
I'm Joel Kotkin.
And today we're celebrating the start of our second season, and we wanted to touch base with you, our viewers, and kind of talk about the show and how we're seeing it and how it's evolved. And, you know, Joel, it might be useful to just kind of start us off with why the hell did we get into this to begin with? What was it we were trying to accomplish?
Well, we were trying to bring out the issues that have come out of our research and that we felt issues that were not being addressed elsewhere, and to begin to engage and bring in all sorts of really interesting guests and new perspectives. And we're going to continually trying to sort of push the envelope. And it's very important to do what we're doing now because media has become so ideologically divided that you don't get sort of the nuanced kind of opinions that you might get from certain people. Because right now, as a journalist, what I find is if I write something that's strident, I get better coverage than if I write something that's really good and reasonable. And this way we have the control of the means of production.
Yeah. Polarization sells. Yeah, but I'm with you. What I find is that there is a total lack of critical thinking out there. Right. You know, people aren't asking themselves kind of the second and third level questions about almost any topic. You know, I mean, one of the things I remember, for instance, one of our podcasts was with Alan Schellenberger.
Michael
Schellenberger, sorry, about the whole topic of climate alarmism, right? And look, I think knowing you and you know me, we're not climate deniers. We know that something's going up, but there's clearly some massive amount of overreaction for that has people not thinking critically about answers, about, you know, well, what is it really going to take to do some of the stuff that's required to be able to make the environment better? And I think our goal is to bring these things out, right, and to have guests that can bring that out.
Right, because things have reactions. Like, for instance, I thought one of our best shows was with Adam Cariati, from UCI, you know, very brilliant psychiatrist, saying we have to look at, if you look at lockdowns, what are the collateral damage that's being done that we don't talk about? I mean, having had a 17-year-old daughter at home for a year, I can tell you that was not pleasant.
Yeah, there's right. I mean, and the whole idea that, you know, there is kind of PTSD for COVID,
right,
is a point that he brought out, and it is making us nuts. It doesn't mean that we believe that, you know, we shouldn't have vaccines or that, you know, or any of that. We have to be cognizant of the fact that everything that we do in life has some kind of a reaction.
Yeah, it reminds me of when I was doing an interview with a young engineering PhD candidate at Stanford, and he was working on electric cars, and he said, the problem is they tell me, don't worry about the electricity. Well, you know, if you're going to electrify automobiles, you're going to have a huge surge of demand on electricity at a time when our electrical supplies are weaker than they were. So let's this fellow I really liked, he said, I'm an engineer. I was trained to understand that if I do this, that will happen. And this is what the podcast is most about. You know, if you do A, And you may be right to do A, but A also causes B, C, D, and E, and you
better think about it.
Right.
So I've got a question back. Let's go back to the original premise of the show, which is calling it the Feudal Future podcast. And of course, you have written a book about the reemergence of feudalism as a trend in society. But really, leaving aside that kind of academic argument, how do you see this notion of feudalism? And are we just blowing smoke, or is it real?
Oh, God, I think that if nothing else, feudalism as a concept has been accelerated. First of all, pestilence is a nice feudal.
Well, hold on. Let's start with. Believe it or not, I actually, in one of my classes at school, I asked students, "What's feudalism?" And I had like no hands go up.
Right.
So, and obviously everybody has a different impression when they hear feudalism, right? Everything from, Robin Hood era to whatever. Right. So as you think of feudalism, and what defines it to you?
Well, I think what feudalism is about is, it's not a bunch of knights with chain mail, swinging swords at each other, or going to conquer the Holy Land or something like that. What feudalism is about a socially stagnant system where upward mobility is very difficult. Property is owned by a small group of people. And as we are trying to combat, where ideologies are just adopted without any sort of idea, is this true? What does this mean? The sort of rational...
It's just that the feudal overlord says you better adopt that.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. I mean, we now have Google basically saying, oh, we're not going to put something on that first of all, it was untrue. Now if it's socially bad. Well, I don't want some little nerd, or even worse, an algorithm up in the Bay Area deciding that, you can't hear about this, even if it might be true. Like a good example, the whole question of the origins of COVID. It's pretty clear now that there's a very decent chance that it was a lab mistake.
A lab accident.
I don't think it was something
intentional.
Mm-hmm. But you have these little Frankensteins, trying to make the viruses worse, which is, to me, almost beyond belief that you would do something that stupid. But when it comes to the U.S. government,
although frankly, weaponization of biological agents is not new. We've had that forever. We have our own U.S. weapons program that does all of this stuff in secret.
Yeah, but this is supposed to be medical research. It's not supposed to kill people. It's supposed to cure people. But I think that what I find really disturbing is that you could not use this line of argument. It was just dismissed, and we now know.
Right.
Good chance that it was true. So the question is, the idea of rationality and trying to look at different perspectives, because in our business life, that's what you do. You have to understand that there's these different ramifications. So what our podcast really talked about is okay, maybe we need this, and this on COVID, but do we have to go to the extent that Australia's gone to? And we had a guest from Australia, Ross Elliott.
Yep.
I mean, it's almost like something out of, Orwell.
Right. You're getting house arrest for 6 weeks while you go through COVID.
And only 1 6-pack of beer.
Right.
Oh my God! A revolution in
the Aussies are going to be floored by that. They only have 1 6-pack of beer. Yeah, but no. The point that you're making is that our whole goal has been to bring out arguments that you're not normally going to hear, that have some rationality. We're not wingnuts, right? We're not using fake news. In fact, if anything, one of the hallmarks of the research that you and I do is an overabundance of facts to be able to look at, not just cherry picking a fact here or there. So our whole idea is that let's bring out the arguments that you're not hearing anywhere else.
Right.
And by the way, maybe there's some controversy. Maybe it upsets some people that we bring it out. Who do you think, who is the most upset of any of our guests that we've had with the discussion?
Well, I think the funniest one, in an entertainment sense, was with the venture capitalist.
Andrew Romans, yeah.
Yeah, where, I mean, to me, he's obviously a very bright guy. he epitomizes the unbelievable combination of arrogance and ignorance, which is what we see in the tech world. Arrogance in that they think that they are some sort of special category of human being who will shape our future whether we like it or not, and ignorance in that not thinking about what this means. Like, for instance, what has happened to small business? Every day I drive down Tustin, which is a big strip here in Orange, and the number of closed stores and the ones, it's not the chains, it's the independents. To understand that if you're going to have a massive shift to digital, it's going to have an impact on lots of other people.
Yeah, but I'm in defense of Andrew. I buy into the argument that of creative destruction. There is no permanence. The world is always evolving. Innovation does, in fact, have its casualties.
Yeah, but the creative destruction is basically I agree that creative destruction takes place. The question is, does it have to take place in a feudalistic way, which the way it is now? In other words, if we had Instagram and WhatsApp as well as Facebook as independent companies competing against each other, I would argue that innovation would be faster. One of the things that's shocking.
So in other words, you're arguing that the current concentration
Yes.
of basically of the large tech companies that end up buying the small companies
Right.
ends up limiting the number of competitors that are out there.
Right, because I started covering Silicon Valley in the 70s. And what was great about Silicon Valley is that we're always competitors. There'd be 7, 8, 10 semiconductor companies. Now, at the end, there would be 2 or 3. But in that process of competition, what astounds me today is I think Microsoft is crappier than it was. I think Google is not as good a search engine as it once was.
But let me argue back to you a little bit. The world of technology, especially the business world of technology, depends on standards emerging. It's really hard to have standards emerging when you have 1,000 competitors in a space. And it's important to have standards because if you don't have standards, then people can't build applications that talk to each other.
Standards don't mean monopoly.
Fair enough. I agree. It doesn't. But there's a far cry between unfettered thousands of competitors in a marketplace and a few.
Yeah, but I think it also depends on the business. I mean, is our life better? Is the economy stronger if all these little independent businesses, not only do they go out of existence or they get acquired? In other words, we're sort of limiting our DNA, if you will. You want to use a biological analogy here. It's as if we're just breeding the same 4 or 5 companies, all breeding with each other, when if we had 100 companies breeding with each other, we would have a much stronger species.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you on that. I agree that the notion of species diversity
Right.
is something that ultimately grows the resilience of the planet, right? And if you have fewer and fewer species, right, you're going to be vulnerable to not having the innovation happen.
And Mike Malone, who's somebody we might think about having as a guest at some point, Malone is, more than me because he's, I've covered Silicon Valley for many years, but, he's obviously living in it and is probably one of the great observers of it. What Malone says is that it used to be, and I can attest to this, lots of people founded companies. They had a dream that they were going to build something big. Now, eventually, they would maybe get acquired or they'd go out of business. But he says now companies are just started by the same group of venture capitalists and private equity people with the intention of being acquired.
Well, okay, but just before we leave that topic, if you were a rational investor, who would you rather take a risk on? Somebody that has proven themselves in the past to be able to build a company successfully, or some wild-ass entrepreneur that has no discipline?
You know what? I'd like to have another Steve Jobs. I'd like what we don't have Steve Jobs anymore. We don't have Jeff Bezos when Jeff was in the beginning, and it wasn't clear that he would be the dominant player.
Yeah, by the way, that's not my experience. My experience is that there are a lot of people with dreams out there, many of whom, are idiots and have no discipline. But there are a ton of them that are trained well at places, by the way, like the Arduous School of Business at Chapman. Put in the plug for the school, but and other kinds of programs where they're getting the kind of discipline to do it. And actually, there's a ton of money out there to fund rational players. So I get the notion of concentration, but I'm not sure that we're actually seeing a lack of innovation at the moment.
I think all the indications on productivity and just your daily experience. I mean, every time I get an update from Microsoft, I say, oh, God, I wish I could say no, because it doesn't make anything better. All of a sudden, something else doesn't work, or they change something for God knows what reason. You know, it would be like in the old days with AT&T with phones, that every 2 months, how I dialed had to change. I mean, it makes no sense. But also, I think there's a big political issue, which is these people have, and this is the more important issue, which we will be discussing, is they have control over the debate. Like, okay, you know, I didn't support Trump, and, you know, so I'm not doing it from that point of view. But the ability of a handful of platforms to literally wipe a story off the map because it might have had a political implication is scary beyond belief.
I agree with you. It's very Orwellian. And
yes.
It worries me, and I think this is an area that we do need to explore more. You know, the other thing I think back to our. So by the way, we obviously, one of the great things about our relationship is that we can agree to disagree on a bunch of things,
sure.
and at least in the discussion, bring it out.
Right.
To me, one of the most interesting shows we had was with Ross Terrell.
Oh, well.
Who is, you know, the Harvard trained China expert who knows personally everybody from Mao onward, and has advised every president, every administration. I thought his view of what is going to be happening in China was just spectacular.
Yeah, and I think that, you know, first of all, from a personal point of view, to have been able to sit down and talk to a scholar who was on close terms with Zhou Enlai it's just one of those experiences. You know, it's like when I was a reporter.
History talking directly to you.
Right,
yeah.
right. Mm-hmm. I mean, I remember doing a story when I was at the Washington Post, doing a interview with a woman who was the mistress of William Faulkner in Hollywood. And to actually be there and talking to a woman who actually knew Fitzgerald and William Faulkner. Now, this is showing my age, you know, but you know, Terrell was like, and also what I found was he is very rational. He wasn't extreme one way or the other, but he was very cognizant of the worries that all of us have about China. You know, we've done a lot of stuff on China. I thought the interview, like with Lee Sun, who's expert on the migrants in China. You know, I think the issue of trying to understand China not as a political issue, whether it's Biden or Trump, but what exactly is going on? What is the nature of what China is doing? And both of us have had considerable exposure to China, so that's useful to us. So I thought the Terrell thing was really interesting. It's also interesting to see Terrell, who was really very far to the left as a young man, having become fairly conservative.
Yeah, what I thought was his most fascinating point was his feeling that multilateralism and, you know, kind of conducting U.S. foreign policy based on having lots of different agreements with lots of different countries so you can somehow create a consensus or avoid conflict is really not the way the world works, and not the way our competitors look at it.
Right.
Especially not the way that China looks at it.
Yeah.
And we're kind of denying that China has its own strategic goals that don't include multilateralism.
Or democracy,
right.
Or freedom of information, or controls over technology.
Right.
But we have to understand that, you know, as somebody who's studied, you know, Chinese history somewhat, and as I know you have too, this is, if you take the long-term view of the last 3,000 years, the most important country in the world is China.
Right.
The only country in modern times that can remotely compete with China is the United States. And we may have alliances. I mean, I think this alliance with Australia, the UK, and I think eventually India, I think, is the key player. This is a new world, and but the idea of these formal alliances, I don't think they work very well. I think he's right about that, and we have to understand the nature of the threat, but also, and I think this is one of the great things about terror, you have to appreciate and respect the Chinese culture, which
Yes.
just because people look at things the other way.
Right. They're coming from a much deeper tradition of what their view of China's place is in the world.
Right.
And it's to vilify it is to deny reality.
Right.
You know, that of course they're going to be coming at life from the way they're coming at it. And
Right.
for us to sit and say, okay, we're coming at life from the way we're viewing it with our set of values is perfectly fine, but to kind of imply that these are two worlds where there's no, you know, there's a no overlap,
Right.
is ridiculous.
Yeah, and I think we and then of course, we've done, some things on, what's happening in California. I think those were very important.
Yeah, we're very concerned about that. Obviously we live here, and so we're very concerned about the future of California, and this is where probably the definition of feudalism
Yes.
is most acutely felt.
Yeah, because what we have in California is fantastic wealth creation. Maybe you really have to go back to the railroads and the early steel guys and, Henry Ford and the people who,
Thank you, tech oligarchs.
right. and I think it's important to understand that this is not a personal thing. I don't think that the people who founded these companies were evil, bad, terrible people. There's something that happens in the operation of a gigantic business that loses its humanity. And I think part of it is you have to continually up the profits. And if you've had high profit levels and you have to keep,
Right.
the only way you can do it is by acquiring companies, squashing the competition.
Well, and the
And
punishment,
squeezing the customer.
this is the essence of investment capital, right?
Right.
I mean, the punishment for missing the growth target or missing the profit target is huge. Companies can lose 30% of their market value overnight when they're like a penny shy of the analysts'
Right.
estimates, and somehow there's a hint that maybe the growth rate would drop. Arguably, this is a very punishing system.
Yes.
And interestingly, when that happens, it's not just the fat cat executives who got, massive stock options. It's people with pension funds who have their IRAs or their public pension managed in the public markets that suddenly isn't worth as much.
Right. No, I think that's true, and I think that what we're seeing here is a process which is, I don't think is creating as much innovation as I think we need to have, because the only way America, in particular, is going to compete with China is innovation. We don't have the engineering horsepower that they have anymore. I don't think.
I don't think that's true. I think this is something that we're doing actually some studies on with innovation
That'd
economy.
be a good thing for us to do as a podcast.
And there's no evidence to show that there are fewer engineers and scientists working on projects. There's no evidence to show that innovation is being less well funded than it was in the past. However, there is evidence to show that our competitors are increasing their spending in innovation, especially with China, especially with AI.
Exactly.
And so from that point of view, it seems like we're not making headway as fast because we have competition that we didn't used to have. But in fact, we are. The innovation economy is alive and kicking.
But one of the big issues we have from a social point of view is in this country we may develop new technologies, but they will be deployed elsewhere, and the ancillary jobs are going to be elsewhere. And I think that social issue in this country, the divide between rich and poor, the lack of upward mobility, a lot of those middle range jobs that technology makes possible end up being done in India. They end up being done in
Right. Even with reshoring, which, by the way, was one of the shows that we had, right? One of the things that we're seeing is that they're not happening here in California, right? We're losing manufacturing jobs. We're losing the jobs that middle-class people can afford to live on, right? You look at the results of the recall election.
Right.
Very, very clearly showing where the opposition to Newsom came from, which was mostly the inland areas,
right,
which are not finding the same level of middle-class jobs available to them.
Right, and what one of the surprising findings, and I would like to get more into this in the future, is that the biggest levels of dissatisfaction were among the young, among the millennials, and the old folks, in Yiddish we'd say Altakakas, us, you know what? We may complain, but we're actually doing really well. Yes, we pay high taxes, but the house we bought for $200,000 is now worth $2 million.
Right.
And my kids, yes, this California education system is really crappy, the K through 12, but my kids graduated years ago. Right. So what we see is that in California there's also a large gap. Plus, I think that I don't know, and this came in the Tom Campbell and Sean Steele conversation. Is there a constituency that can be built between the traditional Republicans, who are overwhelmingly white, with Hispanics and Asian?
Mm-hmm. And I think, to add into that, young.
And young.
Right? Because the big demographic shift that's happening that is affecting all of us is the movement from we boomers to millennials and much younger people.
Right.
And so, they're going to need to step up to the plate. The question is, in what form do they do that? And is it going to be simply by blindly adopting one agenda, the progressive agenda or whatever agenda, or is there going to be some diversity of thinking? And if there isn't, I really worry about, what are these kids going to do for a living going forward?
And I think a show that we would like to do down the road is on the universal income. There would seem to me, I'm working on something on this right now, there would seem to me that there are two things. I think that we would suggest, how do we create more middle-class jobs? How do we keep, engineering companies from moving? How do we convince Elon Musk to build a battery plant in Fresno? That's sort of where we're coming from. But there's a lot of people who say, you know what? In the future, everything will be robotic. Everything will be done by AI. Anything that needs to be done can be done overseas or through an algorithm. And so what we're going to do, the next generation, they're not going to have kids. They're not going to own a house. They're going to sit and, water their house plants, play video games, watch pornography, and smoke pot. And drink. It's very much like
it becomes a listless and pointless society. Right. It just becomes an anesthetized society that doesn't make the kind of strides that it needs. There's some struggle that's required to be able to move the ball forward in life and in society. And if we don't have the incentive system there that enables people or gives people the energy to succeed, and everybody can just, okay, we're just great, we're going to slide along with my pot allowance, what will we become? That's feudalism.
Right, and of course the other question is, where is the money going to come from?
Right.
Even if we took every penny of Mark Zuckerberg away, how long would that last?
Right.
And if we're going to be paying, let's say, $2,000 a month, because when they talk about UBI and paying $500 a month, that's not going to get you anywhere in California,
right?
Or New York,
or frankly anywhere.
Right.
Right.
I mean, it might be a subsidy if I want to do some business under the table that I might be able to add to the pot, but so to speak. But the reality is that this society is facing choice. I wrote the book on feudalism, and we do the podcast in part because we don't want this future to take place. But you've got to be aware of what it is before you combat it.
Well, that's a great way to wrap up with our thoughts about where we've been and where we're going. I think our theme of feudal future is definitely ripe for being able to drill deeper into different issues that people are going to be facing, and I'm looking forward to the next season as it unfolds.
Yeah,
great to be a partner with you on the show.
Yeah, I've enjoyed it, and I think we're really developing a good audience, and for us, particularly for me, having made my living by writing mostly, it's been a transition, but we've had some good help, and I think we're developing an audience. So I'm looking forward to it as well.
Great, thanks.
Thank you.
We'll see you soon on a future episode of the Feudal Future podcast.